Welcome to the second video in our reading group series, Reading and Discussing Blackshirts and Reds by Michael Parenti. This time we will be beginning the first chapter of the book, titled Rational Fascism. We will read through the first section of this chapter, Plutocrats choose Autocrats, then have a group discussion. Now that we'll be getting into our discussion, I do need to give you a disclaimer that because our reading groups are open to the public, and we encourage discussion of any ideas people bring to the table, this does mean that some of the ideas expressed in our discussion might not reflect the actual views of our party on any level. We encourage everyone watching to think critically of any ideas expressed. If you have a disagreement with anything that's said in our discussions throughout the video, and no one participating in the discussion brings it up to discuss as a group, please feel free to let us know in the comments and we can address it. Critically examining things is always the best way for all of us to learn and better understand the world, each other, and even ourselves. As Mao Zedong said, the Communist Party does not fear criticism because we are Marxists. The truth is on our side, and the basic masses, the workers and peasants, are on our side. Now, I'll hand it off to Daniel to kick off the reading group.
All right, so as we get going into the chapters here, each chapter, as I think I mentioned, is broken up into anywhere from like 4 to 7 sections. So the way I've designed this is we'll read just one section, and then there will be 1 or 2 discussion questions afterwards. And then we'll just see how many sections we can get through and how quickly we can get through them. And then at the end of each chapter, there will be a kind of final thoughts. Is there anything we haven't talked about that someone wanted to mention or anything like that? I know I keep mentioning the goal being to get through a chapter a week, but I don't want to rush through this at the expense of a meaningful conversation. So keep that in mind. I will try to keep us on track, but if we're having a really important conversation with some important points being made and discussed, I'm not going to just arbitrarily end it. That's more important to me than trying to get to the end of the chapter, because again, we can always extend this further past the date that we circled on the calendar. Okay, do we have any volunteers to start reading this first section? Okay, I will read then. All right, Chapter 1, Rational Fascism. Fascism historically has been used to secure the interests of large capitalist interests against the demands of popular democracy. Then and now, fascism has made irrational mass appeals in order to secure the rational ends of class domination. While walking through New York's Little Italy, I passed a novelty shop that displayed posters and T-shirts of Benito Mussolini giving the fascist salute. When I entered the shop and asked the clerk why such items were being offered, he replied, "Well, some people like them, and, maybe we need someone like Mussolini in this country." His comment was a reminder that fascism survives as something more than a historical curiosity. Worse than posters or T-shirts are the works by various writers bent on explaining Hitler or reevaluating Franco, or in other ways, sanitizing fascist history. In Italy, during the 1970s, there emerged a veritable cottage industry of books and articles claiming that Mussolini not only made the trains run on time, but also made Italy work well. All these publications, along with many conventional academic studies, have one thing in common. They say little, if anything, about the class policies of fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. How did these regimes deal with social services, taxes, business, and the conditions of labor? For whose benefit and at whose expense? Most of the literature on fascism and Nazism does not tell us. Among the thousands of titles that deal with fascism, there are a few worthwhile exceptions that do not evade questions of political economy and class power, for instance. And feel free to pause the video to take a note of these titles if you would like. All right, Plutocrats choose Autocrats. Let us begin with a look at fascism's founder. Born in 1883, the son of a blacksmith, Benito Mussolini's early manhood was marked by street brawls, arrests, jailings, and violent radical political activities. Before World War I, Mussolini was a socialist. A brilliant organizer, agitator, and gifted journalist, he became editor of the Socialist Party's official newspaper. Yet many of his comrades suspected him of being less interested in advancing socialism than in advancing himself. Indeed, when the Italian upper class tempted him with recognition, financial support, and the promise of power, he did not hesitate to switch sides. By the end of World War I, Mussolini the socialist, who had organized strikes for workers and peasants, had become Mussolini the fascist, who broke strikes on behalf of financiers and landowners. Using the huge sums he received from wealthy interests, he projected himself onto the national scene as the acknowledged leader of I Fasci di Combattimento, a movement composed of black-shirted ex-army officers and sundry toughs who were guided by no clear political doctrine other than a militaristic patriotism and conservative dislike for anything associated with socialism and organized labor. The fascist blackshirts spent their time attacking trade unionists, socialists, communists, and farm cooperatives. After World War I, Italy had settled into a pattern of parliamentary democracy. The low pay scales were improving, and the trains were already running on time. But the capitalist economy was in a post-war recession. Investments stagnated, heavy industry operated far below capacity, and corporate profits and agribusiness exports were declining. To maintain profit levels, the large landowners and industrialists would have to slash wages and raise prices. The state, in turn, would have to provide them with the massive subsidies and tax exemptions. To finance this corporate welfarism, the populace would have to be taxed more heavily, and social services and welfare expenditures would have to be drastically cut, measures that might sound familiar to us today. But the government was not completely free to pursue this course. By 1921, many Italian workers and peasants were unionized and had their own political organizations. With demonstrations, strikes, boycotts, factory takeovers, and the forcible occupation of farmlands, they had won the right to organize, along with concessions in wages and work conditions. To impose a full measure of austerity upon workers and peasants, the ruling economic interests would have to abolish the democratic rights that helped the masses defend their modest living standards. The solution was to smash their unions, political organizations, and civil liberties. Industrialists and big landowners wanted someone at the helm who could break the power of organized workers and farm laborers and impose a stern order on the masses. For this task, Benito Mussolini, armed with his gangs of blackshirts, seemed the likely candidate. Footnote 2. Between January and May 1921, the fascists destroyed 120 labor headquarters, attacked 243 socialist centers and other buildings, killed 202 workers, in addition to 44 killed by the police and gendarmerie, and wounded 1,144. During this time, 2,240 workers were arrested and only 162 fascists. In the 1921-22 period up to Mussolini's seizure of state power, 500 labor halls and cooperative stores were burned and 900 socialist municipalities were dissolved. Source: Dutt, Fascism and Social Revolution, page 124. In 1922, the Federazione Industriale, composed of the leaders of industry, along with representatives from the banking and agribusiness associations, met with Mussolini to plan the March on Rome, contributing 20 million lire to the undertaking. With the additional backing of Italy's top military officers and police chiefs, the fascist revolution, really a coup d'etat, took place. Within 2 years after seizing state power, Mussolini had shut down all opposition newspapers and crushed the Socialist, Liberal, Catholic, Democratic, and Republican parties, which together had commanded some 80% of the vote. Labor leaders, peasant leaders, parliamentary delegates, and others critical of the new regime were beaten, exiled, or murdered by fascist terror squadristi. The Italian Communist Party endured the severest repression of all, yet managed to maintain a courageous underground resistance that eventually evolved into armed struggle against the Blackshirts and the German occupation force. In Germany, a similar pattern of complicity between fascists and capitalists emerged. German workers and farm laborers had won the right to unionize the 8-hour workday and unemployment insurance. But to revive profit levels, heavy industry and big finance wanted wage cuts for their workers and massive state subsidies and tax cuts for themselves. During the 1920s, the Nazi Sturmarbeitlung, or SA, the brown-shirted stormtroopers, subsidized by business, were used mostly as an anti-labor parliamentary force whose function was to terrorize workers and farm laborers. By 1930, most of the tycoons had concluded that the Weimar Republic no longer served their needs and was too accommodating to the working class. They greatly increased their subsidies to Hitler, propelling the Nazi Party onto the national stage. Business tycoons supplied the Nazis with generous funds for fleets of motor cars and loudspeakers to saturate the cities and villages of Germany, along with funds for Nazi Party organizations, youth groups, and paramilitary forces. In the July 1932 campaign, Hitler had sufficient funds to fly to 50 cities in the last 2 weeks alone. In that same campaign, the Nazis received 37.3% of the vote, the highest they ever won in a democratic national election. They never had a majority of the people on their side. To the extent that they had any kind of reliable base, it generally was among the more affluent members of society. In addition, elements of the petty bourgeoisie and many lumpen proletariats served as strong-arm party thugs, organized into the SA stormtroopers. But the great majority of the organized working class supported the communists or social democrats to the very end. In the December 1932 election, 3 candidates ran for president: the conservative incumbent Field Marshal von Hindenburg, the Nazi candidate Adolf Hitler, and the Communist Party candidate Ernst Thielmann. In his campaign, Thielmann argued that a vote for Hindenburg amounted to a vote for Hitler, and that Hitler would lead Germany into war. The bourgeois press, including the Social Democrats, denounced this view as Moscow-inspired. Hindenburg was re-elected while the Nazis dropped approximately 2 million votes in the Reichstag election as compared to their peak of over 13.7 million. True to form, the Social Democratic leaders refused the Communist Party's proposal to form an 11th hour coalition against Nazism. As in many other countries, past and present, so in Germany, the Social Democrats would sooner ally themselves with the reactionary right than make common cause with the Reds. Footnote 3. Earlier in 1924, Social Democrat officials in the Ministry of Interior used Reichswehr and Free Corps fascist paramilitary troops to attack left-wing demonstrators. They imprisoned 7,000 workers and suppressed Communist Party newspapers. Richard Plant, The Pink Triangle, New York, Henry Holt, 1986, page 47. Meanwhile, a number of right-wing parties coalesced behind the Nazis, and in January 1933, just weeks after the election, Hindenburg invited Hitler to become chancellor. Upon assuming state power, Hitler and his Nazis pursued a politico-economic agenda not unlike Mussolini's. They crushed organized labor and eradicated all elections, opposition parties, and independent publications. Hundreds of thousands of opponents were imprisoned, tortured, or murdered. In Germany, as in Italy, the communists endured the severest political repression of all groups. Here were 2 peoples, the Italians and Germans, with different histories, cultures, and languages, and supposedly different temperaments, who ended up with the same repressive solutions because of the compelling similarities of economic power and class conflict that prevailed in their respective countries. In such diverse countries as Lithuania, Croatia, Romania, Hungary, and Spain, a similar fascist pattern emerged to do its utmost to save big capital from the impositions of democracy. Footnote 4. This is not to gainsay that cultural differences can lead to important variations. Consider, for instance, the horrific role played by anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany as compared to fascist Italy. Okay, so that's the end of the first section of Chapter 1. The question we have here is, what do the parallel histories of the advent of fascism in Italy and Germany in the 1920s and 1930s tell us about the causes and roots of fascism?
It is the bourgeoisie's fallback when they either refuse to or cannot give any more ground. And particularly when there was a strong workers' movement that made them realize, hey, this is kind of scary. But then they, in the case of Germany, did crush it and then wanted to make sure that it didn't come back again. And then in the case of Italy, they still needed to crush it, in which case they used the fascists.
Like an immune system for capitalism.
Yeah, I think Parenti does a really good job here of laying out the class dynamics. As has been said, fascism is the last fallback position of capitalists when they are faced with popular demands that are difficult for them to ignore or overcome outright, but if relented to, would make a serious dent in their profits and their ability to do business. So instead of doing that, they tend to resort to fascism. Anything else? Anything about strictly economic causes or anything like that?
Tends to have some sort of economic crisis of sorts that would precipitate it, that would cause uh what's the belt tightening mindset.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, the way I see it is, it's I would imagine Lenin's one that said this. I've heard it attributed to Trotsky, but I would bet it's Lenin. That fascism is capitalism in decay, and I think one of the meanings of that saying is that economically, it's when capitalism just enters its bust cycle, and the popular resistance to reigniting the capitalist cycle becomes too great for the capitalists to just impose the new boom cycle on them because the people know, like, hey, we're too desperate. This is not going to work for us anymore. So I think that's I think it's the economic root of the popular demands that fascists and the bourgeoisie want to ignore, and that's why they turn to the fascists.
I would note that historically fascism has also only been able to be implemented when there is like a opening of weakness within the workers' movement. Like even in Italy, in which there wasn't really the workers' movement wasn't really crushed in the same way it was in Germany. They still like failed to follow through with a revolution when the time is right, and kind of faltered because of it, which led to a sort of weakness within the workers' movement that allowed fascism to march right on and do what it did.
Yeah, for sure. I believe it was Rosa Luxemburg that said that. I think she's the one that coined the phrase socialism or barbarism.
Mm-hmm.
So fascism was what happens when the masses fail to achieve socialism,
Mm-hmm.
which kind of makes sense because typically the opening for a socialist revolution comes about when capitalism is in crisis. And so the only two solutions at that point are you either get out of the cycle altogether or you just go back to repeating it.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, sorry, that was I forgot about the mute button. That was Karl Kautsky, by the way. Luxembourg just popularized it.
Ah, okay. Well, at least Kautsky was good for something. So the answer that I came up with was fascism is capitalism in decay. The class antagonisms and contradictions in capitalist societies eventually reach a point of deadlock where they can no longer effectively be managed by the state or managed in favor of capital. Chief among these contradictions is the necessity for profit and continuous accrual of capital as the driving force of capitalist production on the one hand, and the necessity of workers for securing their own material needs, such as food, housing, safe working conditions, and a dignified existence. When the power of the proletariat as a class becomes strong enough to threaten the profit motive, the capitalist system enters crisis as profits decrease and the economy stagnates. In order to break the deadlock, the bourgeoisie, in the form of big business, supports fascists in order to take over the state. The fascists turn the full force of the state against labor and abandon any liberal democratic norms that have been established up to that point in order to break labor's capacity to organize, thus allowing capital as a class to reassert its dominance over labor.
Thanks for tuning into this video, and thanks to everyone that attended our reading group live. We hope you got something out of this. If you enjoyed this video and want to attend a reading group live yourself, please feel free to reach out to us via email at milwaukee@cpusa.org, DM us on any of our social media, or just come say hi to us at an event that we're at. See you in the next video covering the second section of Chapter 1. Whom did the fascists support?